A quiet, unnoticed, and deeply unremarkable man was sitting in a beat-up truck, but behind those blank eyes and awkward smiles was a deeply disturbed mind. It started with rejection, twisted into obsession, and exploded into something the world would never forget, with bodies upon bodies piling up with no end in sight. What police uncovered stretched across rivers, graveyards, and state lines. Joel David Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959, in New York City. But his beginning was not wrapped in the warmth of family. His young biological parents gave him up almost immediately, and just 3 weeks later he was adopted by a middle-class couple living in the quiet suburbs of Long Island. On the surface, it seemed like a fresh start, but something in Joel never quite settled. It didn't take much for the other children to notice how odd he was, and once they did, the cruelty began. He became a target and was taunted, excluded, and laughed at. His memory of that time clung to a single line: "I was the last kid chosen for games." That sentence became a symbol of his early years, a quiet echo that followed him everywhere. Despite testing with a high IQ of 128, Joel struggled relentlessly in school, not because he couldn't understand, but because he couldn't read the way the others did. By the time he reached junior high, the hunger to belong had grown into something desperate. He tried joining the track team, imagining for once he might be accepted. But instead of finding friends, he found torment. His teammates held him under running water, shoved rotting animals into his locker, and filled his gym bag with foam and shaving cream. Unable to take it, he eventually quit. Still hoping to find his place, he joined the high school yearbook staff, latching onto his one passion, photography. For a brief moment, it seemed like a lifeline. But just days into it, his camera was stolen. When the yearbook party came, he wasn't invited. One classmate remembered how crushed he looked. Even his mother later convinced that she had no idea how deeply her son was being tormented. By 17, Joel was emotionally stranded. He had tried everything to be liked and seen, but every door seemed to close in his face. While others laughed and lived easily, Joel simmered in a cocktail of resentment and shame. The rejection had fermented into something darker. He turned inward, letting anger build silently, feeding it with lonely thoughts that gradually warped into violent fantasies. The turning point came quietly, in the form of a film. In 1972, Joel saw Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy, a thriller about a man who strangles women across London. For most viewers, it was an unsettling fiction, but for Joel, it was something else entirely. That same year, his parents gave him a car. They meant it to be a gesture of trust, of freedom. But what they unknowingly handed him was a weapon. With it, Joel began to cruise the late-night streets of East Meadow and Manhattan, searching not for friends or fun, but for company, the kind he could buy. By 1977, he was enrolled at Nassau Community College, but only technically. In reality, he was barely there. He skipped classes, burned through what little money he had on escorts, and slowly let go of the idea that life might ever be different. He drifted from one meaningless job to the next, never settling. He didn't date, bond, or build anything. Instead, he wandered. And as he wandered, the fantasies continued to sharpen. The isolation was complete, and home brought no comfort. In 1987, after 10 years, he dropped out of school for good, losing the last shred of structure in his life. That year, his adoptive father Bernard, a reserved, disciplined man who had long struggled with illness, took his own life, Joel was left to carry the emotional wreckage and was even called to testify about the death later that year. The burden was heavy and Joel was already spiraling. He wasn't equipped to cope, and no one knew just how far gone he was. Later that year's summer, police briefly recorded Joel's name during a prostitution sting in Hempstead. He was arrested, but nothing came of it. It was just another name on another piece of paper and was quickly forgotten. But that moment, too, was a thread in the unraveling that was coming. It's a moment of high tension. What are you going to do next? Click the little subscribe button right down there. Then, click the other one that looks like this. Thanks. Let's get back to the story. By 1989, the fantasies had been brewing for nearly 2 decades, and finally, something inside him broke. He decided it was time. His mother was out of town, and the house was empty. He drove into the city, where he picked up 25-year-old Heidi Susie Balch, a young, attractive blonde, and brought her back to his place on Long Island. In the basement of his mother's house, under a dim, flickering light, Joel retrieved a heavy artillery shell that he had bought at a flea market. What happened next was nothing short of horrifying. He struck her over and over, 20, maybe 30 times, until her skull caved and her body fell still. But he wasn't finished. What followed was calculated, not chaotic. Using an X-Acto knife, he carefully removed her fingertips. Then with pliers, he pulled out her teeth. Piece by piece, he erased her identity. When he was done, he dismembered her with clinical precision, placing her limbs in trash bags and sealed her head inside an old paint can. For 2 full days, her remains sat in his home. On the 3rd morning, just before sunrise, Joel loaded the can into his car and drove to a quiet golf course in Hopewell, New Jersey, where he buried the can beneath some pine needles. Then he drove north, discarded her legs into a shallow creek, and later released the rest of her body into the East River. When a maintenance worker stumbled on the paint can, he expected trash. Instead, he uncovered a human head. It was all the authorities had. There was no name, no history, just a haunting fragment of a woman whose story had been cut short. The case stalled, and the press couldn't even tell the public who she was. Back in East Meadow, Joel returned to his quiet life. He smiled when needed, helped his mother with errands, and kept a low profile. No one suspected that the man who lived next door was harboring a secret so monstrous it would one day shock the world. But one death didn't satisfy him. A year later, in 1990, he hunted again. This time, he picked up a woman known only as Julie Blackbird. Whether that was her real name remains a mystery. She ended up in the same basement where Joel used a wooden table leg to beat her, then strangled her until she went limp. Once again, he dismembered her body, stuffed her remains into cement-filled buckets, and dropped them into the East River once again. The rest was dumped into a Brooklyn canal. And by 1991, Joel had grown more confident. He used his savings to start a landscaping business, which gave him access to tools, a workshop, and most importantly, a secluded bungalow upstate. He used it to store bodies until decomposition became manageable. With each victim, he fine-tuned his methods and started using things like gloves, tarps, and bleach. He even began disposing of the bodies the same night, trusting the water to conceal the evidence. But that same year, the bodies began surfacing. Barbara Jacobs' head and limbs appeared in the Hudson River in July. Yoon Lee was found weeks later near Manhattan's East River. Mary Ellen DeLuca's dismembered remains were discovered in Cornwall, upstate New York, in October. Each woman had vanished without a trace, and when fragments of them were found, they told police nothing. No pattern emerged because the victims wore different clothes, had different lives, and came from different places. Joel Rifkin, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. But the truth was slowly creeping closer. As if a hidden switch had finally flipped, his quiet, calculated rage turned into a relentless storm. That summer, the city of New York began to feel the true weight of what it meant to have a serial killer hiding in plain sight. Bodies began surfacing, quietly at first, but then with a frequency that left even seasoned detectives unnerved. On July 9th, 2 more bodies were found floating in the murky waters of Coney Island Creek. The victims were identified as Mary Ann Susie Holloman, age 39, and Lorraine Orvito, age 28. They had both been strangled and dumped eerily close together, as if discarded after some ritual. The brutality and symmetry of the killings immediately raised red flags. Clearly, this was not random. Investigators began whispering about the possibility of a pattern, a single predator weaving violence through the veins of the city, but they didn't have a name yet. Then, later that month, another grim discovery surfaced. A medical student, walking along the banks of the Harlem River, spotted something hidden in the underbrush. What he found was the near-skeletonized, headless body of Violet O'Neill, a 21-year-old woman who had been missing for 3 years. The horror of her condition was unbearable, and yet it was only the beginning. On November 17th, the Harlem River gave up another secret. The body of 23-year-old Jenny Soto emerged, her remains bound and weighted down, which was an intentional attempt to keep her hidden forever. Just over a month later, on December 21st, a torso washed ashore near Yorktown, New York. It belonged to 31-year-old Mary Catherine Williams. While detectives scrambled to connect the pieces, Joel Rifkin moved through life like a shadow. He had no criminal record linking him to anything violent. If someone saw him, he looked unremarkable. A man with dirt under his fingernails from landscaping jobs. He kept his secrets buried deep, his truck spotless, his tools well organized. Even his family, including his mother and sister Jan, had no idea what lurked behind his soft-spoken exterior. Forensic teams worked frantically, gathering what they could: hairs, flecks of skin, bits of torn clothing. But with no suspect, the victims became numbers. One woman was listed only as number 6, her torso pulled from a canal in Brooklyn. Another was number 9, her body found in the oily waters of the Gowanus Canal. It was as if the women were vanishing, only to return in pieces and without names. Then on June 24th, 1993, Joel Rifkin crossed paths with someone who would change everything: a worried boyfriend named Dave Rubenstein. That night, Joel picked up 22-year-old Tiffany Bresciani, a young woman working the streets of the Lower East Side. Tiffany had come to Manhattan with dreams of being a Broadway star, and instead had fallen into the rough circumstances of heroin addiction. But still, she carried a spark. Dave, her boyfriend and former lead singer of the punk rock band Reagan Youth, was protective. He saw Joel pick Tiffany up in his mother's blue Toyota sedan and sensed that something was off. He waited for Tiffany to return, expecting that she would be back in 20 minutes, and they would use the money to get high, which had become a usual pattern for them. She kissed him and left, but she never returned. 2 days passed in silence, and then came the phone call. Tiffany was missing, and Joel's mother's blue Toyota matched the one Dave had seen that night. Suddenly, Joel Rifkin's quiet world began to unravel. What happened next defied logic. Around 5:30 a.m. on June 24th, shortly after picking her up, Joel had killed Tiffany in a parking lot. He strangled her and then, without panic, drove back to his mother's house as if nothing had happened. He stopped at a hardware store, casually picked up rope and a plastic tarp. Meanwhile, Tiffany's body lay lifeless in the backseat of his car. For 3 days, he kept her hidden in the garage, just feet from where his mother walked and talked unaware. The smell grew thick and sour, and finally, on June 28th, Joel decided to move the body. He wrapped her up, loaded her into the trunk, and headed out, thinking once again he could erase what he'd done, but fate intervened. At 3:15 a.m., June 28th, just a mile down the Southern State Parkway, a state trooper noticed Joel's truck driving without a rear license plate. The flashing blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror, and instead of stopping, Joel pressed the gas. What followed was a 20-minute chase through the dark in the empty roads of Long Island. Rifkin weaved through side streets and service roads, speeding past gas stations and grocery stores. It felt like the night was collapsing in on him, like the end was finally catching up. Then, near Brookhaven Town Hall, it all ended. He slammed into a utility pole. The crash silenced the engine. The airbag exploded, and the world went still, except for the unmistakable smell of rot. Troopers approached cautiously, and when they opened the back of the truck, they froze. Beneath the blue tarp was Tiffany's corpse. Her ankles were bound, and her skin had bloated. One trooper radioed for backup. Another stared at Joel, who sat on the curb in a daze. His face bloodied from the crash, but his eyes held nothing. Inside the vehicle, officers found Tiffany's ID, a lipstick case smeared with blood, and rope frayed from use. It was no longer speculation. They had their man. And then Joel did something no one expected. He started talking. Back at the station, in a Nassau County holding cell, Joel Rifkin calmly began to confess. Not just to Tiffany's murder, but to all of them. He asked for a pen and paper and made lists of names, nicknames, and places. He drew rough maps, pointing to rivers and parks and highways where he had left bodies behind. He said he had killed 17 women. His voice never wavered. He spoke like someone reading from a list he'd memorized long ago. One NYPD officer later remembered Rifkin's tone as chilling. There was no remorse, no emotion. He confessed to dismemberment with the same detachment someone might describe their grocery list. He said he cut them up so I wouldn't get caught. When asked why he killed, his answers were vague and cold. Some of them made me feel like shit, he said. Others, he claimed, just couldn't please me. He even wondered aloud if he was evil or simply damaged. A later brain scan revealed abnormalities in his frontal lobe, the area that controls impulse and restraint. Whether he was born this way or shaped by years of isolation and rejection, no one could ever say for sure. Joel Rifkin confessed to 17 murders, but authorities could only connect him to 9. The rest were still faceless, nameless, buried under water and time. Still, the headlines exploded. New York's deadliest killer was finally caught, and Joel sat quietly in his cell, not asking for a lawyer, not begging for sympathy, just waiting. In May 1994, Joel pleaded guilty to the murder of Tiffany Bresciani. He admitted it, described it, and offered no excuse. When the judge asked if he understood the gravity of his actions, Joel simply nodded. He accepted his fate with the same silence that had cloaked him all along. For Tiffany's murder, he was sentenced to 25 years to life, plus extra years for the wild chase. That was just the beginning. One by one, New York prosecutors in Queens, Brooklyn, and Suffolk counties held hearings. Over a frantic summer, Joel Rifkin quietly admitted to more victims. Each time the question was asked, he answered the same. He strangled her, cut her up, and dumped the pieces. By July 1994, he was formally convicted of 9 murders, the ones with evidence, like bodies or DNA. But he quietly took the fall for everything on the list, even for bodies they might never find. Finally, on a hot June day in 1994, the judge pronounced a sentence that felt like a death sentence. Rifkin was given the maximum penalty, 203 years. Life in prison. That meant he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. If every appeal were denied, and they were, he would die behind bars. The courtroom was silent when it was over. The families of the victims had long letters and spoken words to the judge about their pain, but Joel Rifkin had nothing to say. He met the verdict with flat eyes, cold as stone. He was sent to Attica Correctional Facility, a supermax prison upstate. The guards there said he was so notorious and hated by the other inmates that he couldn't safely be in the general population. For years, he spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, only coming out to shower in a steel cage. Rifkin quietly sued, arguing that the constant isolation was cruel. The courts later agreed with the prison. After all, his crimes were so heinous that officials argued he wouldn't last a week with others. The police never completely closed every file on him. A few murders remained suspicious. In some obscure district, if another girl disappeared that fit his MO, it was quietly wondered, was it another of Rifkin's victims? In 2001, a jury in New Jersey revisited Susie Balch's case and ruled that yes, Rifkin was guilty, even in absentia, retroactively tying that skull in the can to him. But there are still unanswered questions in cold case files. I remember hearing about the Joel Rifkin case on the news when I was growing up on Long Island. Back then, the only way to learn the details of a story like this was to read about it in the newspaper. The TV news stuck to the broad details and shock statements, then a brief synopsis of what was happening, and on to the next headline. Because of this, a lot of these details were new to me, despite having been living where it happened as it was happening. Were you ever close to a major news story as it happened and didn't learn about it until later? Or were you ever an eyewitness to a newsworthy event? Tell me the details in the comments section. Thanks for joining me for another edition of Fridays with Tony, where we explore stories that are always unusual, often unsettling, and sometimes still unsolved. See you next time.